Back in Canada, the Liberal Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau had resigned the leadership of his party and with it the premiership, after polls showed that he was deeply unpopular and the party would likely lose the upcoming election with him in charge. To replace him, the Liberal Party chose John Turner, who had retired from politics some years earlier and was not actually an MP or senator anymore. This meant that from now until the election in September, the Canadian Prime Minister couldn't actually appear in Parliament. There were ways round this. Someone could resign a safe seat and he could stand as a candidate in their place, but Turner elected to wait until the election and stand as a candidate in Vancouver because the Liberal Party was unpopular in Western Canada and he wished to signal that the region was important to him. Liechtenstein became the last country in Europe to give women the right to vote after a referendum on women's suffrage, in which only men were allowed to vote, came back 51.3% in favour, though the small canton of Appenzell in Switzerland held out against women's suffrage until the 1990s. Controversial churchman David Jenkins was consecrated Bishop of Durham in York. The new bishop had been quoted, and sometimes misquoted, as doubting the literal truth of some elements of Christianity such as the virgin birth and the resurrection, which led to a 12,000 signature petition being delivered to the Archbishop of York, Dr. John Habgood, and the consecration in York Minster was interrupted twice by protesters. The day after this, Pierre Trudeau made his last formal appearance as Canadian Prime Minister at the 10th G7 summit in London, alongside François Mitterrand of France, Helmut Kohl of West Germany, Bettino Craxi of Italy, Yasuhiro Nakasone of Japan, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and European Commission President Gaston Thorn. Also in London, a meeting at the Gays the Word bookshop saw the foundation of the group Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners in order to help raise funds. With National Union of Mine Workers funds stopped by the government, small groups like this sought to twin directly with affected communities, and after some hesitation, the group were accepted by a village in South Wales. The unlikely combination of deeply traditional Welsh miners and flamboyant London gays and lesbians drew the eye of the media and inspired the 2014 film Pride, which is well worth a watch.
Die! Your gays have arrived!
The European Championships concluded in France. The host nation made heavy weather of their semi-final with Portugal, with an extra-time goal by Platini sending them through, while Denmark took Spain to penalties before an agonising miss by Preben Elkjær sent them home. Platini scored his 9th goal of the 5-game tournament in a 2-0 win to give France their first ever international trophy. And Diego Maradona became the most expensive footballer ever when he transferred from Barcelona to Napoli for an eye-watering $10.48 million, £6.9 million. The F1 teams and media, meanwhile, arrived in Dallas, Texas for their first look at the new circuit, laid out in the city's Fair Park, and attended by some of the glamour often missing from Detroit, with cast members of popular soap opera Dallas in attendance. Unusually, and unwisely according to some pundits, the city hadn't been required to host a test event, and there were some worries about the organisation, but the circuit layout looked like it ought to be interesting, even if visually it might as well have been Detroit or Long Beach with its concrete walls and high fences. Spirit had a replacement Hart engine after having had to use a Ford for most of Detroit due to lack of spares, and Arrows had flown out an extra A7 BMW chassis for Sura, so now both their drivers were in the same machinery. Meanwhile, Brabham had tried to remount the oil cooler to save their drivers' feet, only to find that it affected the balance of the car and they were finding it tough going. And scrutineering after the Detroit race had found impurities and lead shot in the water from the tanks of the Tyrrell cars. Other teams had long suspected that the water top-up stops the team had made towards the end of most races were some kind of secret refuelling setup, and initial analysis showed the impurities were hydrocarbons, potentially indicating fuel. Samples were sent for proper analysis, and Ken Tyrrell was summoned to a meeting with FISA in Paris on July the 18th to explain himself. Some of the worries about the Dallas organisation proved founded, and the weather was unusually hot, even for Texas in July, but the big problem on Friday was the track surface. Right from the start of the first familiarisation sessions it was breaking up badly, and times in the afternoon qualifying session were noticeably slower. There were accidents too on the unfamiliar track. Arnoux and Lauda both had offs, Cecotto demolished his Tolman, and Alio destroyed the Ram chassis his team had just finished putting back together after Detroit. Most serious of all though was Martin Brundle, who had a colossal off in the Yardley branded Tyrrell and broke bones in both his feet. Practice was stopped for half an hour as he was extracted from the car and patched up enough to fly home on Sunday night, upgraded by British Caledonian to first class to give him space to put his feet up, but he would play no further part in the weekend and looked to be potentially out for several weeks, if not months. With the exception of Derek Warwick and Mark Seurer, nobody improved their times on Saturday. Several didn't even try, unwilling to risk breaking a precious chassis, as most teams were beginning to run out of spares after a month on the road. And so, Nigel Mansell took his second career pole, with teammate Elio De Angelis alongside for Lotus's first front-row lockout since 1978. Warwick had promoted himself from 7th to 3rd on Saturday, and would start alongside Arnoux, with Lauda and a very impressive Senna on row 3, ahead of Prost, Rosberg, Alboreto and Tombe making up the top 10, and Piquet, an unhappy 12th, outqualified by his teammate Corrado Fabi. Beloff put his Tyrrell 17th, Lafitte was a dismal 25th in the Williams, behind even Alio, and Brundle's absence meant that everybody would qualify once again. A Can-Am race was scheduled on Saturday evening, and Lauda tried to get it called off to save the surface deteriorating further, but this couldn't be done. Though, at Bernie Eccleston's insistence, the organisers had the track patched up with quick-drying cement overnight. Instead of the usual morning warm-up the next day, drivers would get 3 exploratory laps each to get used to the new surface without tearing it up too much, and because the race was scheduled for an 11 a.m. start to avoid the worst of the heat, this would begin at 7:45 a.m. Nobody in the F1 paddock seemed particularly happy at the arrangements, and Lauda and Prost sounded out the others on the idea of boycotting the race, but Rosberg, among others, wasn't keen. Quote, "I don't know what all the fuss is about. We'll all complain and bind right up to the start time, and then we'll go out and race as usual. We've come all this way, and the race is all set up. Track surface or no track surface, you know as well as I do, we'll race," he said to reporters. That said, he did have one advantage over the others. Both Keke and teammate Jacques Lafitte were wearing innovative water-cooled skull caps under their helmets. Nonetheless, none of the drivers were what you'd call happy at the prospect of anything up to 2 hours at extremely high temperatures with a bumpy disintegrating surface. The overnight repairs were still going on Sunday morning, and the warm-up had to be cancelled, much to the annoyance of all present, who instead got a tour of the course in golf carts. Jacques Lafitte had actually turned out in his pyjamas, presumably to make the point about the early hour. The repairs were finally finished 30 minutes before the scheduled start, leaving the drivers to get a quick warm-up in before lining up on the grid for the parade lap in ambient temperatures of 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 degrees Celsius, and the organisers had agreed to cut the race from 78 to 68 laps, and to include the parade lap in the total, leaving 67 laps of actual racing. The Ram team had failed to rebuild Alio's car in time, and he would miss the start, so it was just 25 cars who would be waved off by Dallas-star Larry Hagman. And both Arnoux and Winkelhock stayed resolutely put and had to be given push starts to get them going round to the back of the grid. Finally, after much drama, the lights went green, and Mansell got the perfect start to retain his lead, with teammate De Angelis slotting in behind, pursued by Warwick, Senna, who'd come up from 6th to 4th, the McLarens, Rosberg, Alboreto, Tombe and the rest. Rosberg made his way ahead of Prost into 6th, while Mansell began to eke out a lead over De Angelis. François Hainaut was the first retirement, with a first-lap incident missed by the cameras, which were fixed on the leading Lotus cars, and the local commentators remembered that the last time the black and gold JPS cars had been leading 1-2 like this, one of them had been driven by American legend Mario Andretti on his way to the world title of 1978. Senna had a go at Warwick, got it all wrong and spun, though he kept it going and rejoined at the back, then vibrated his way back round to the pits on flat-spotted tyres for a new set of boots. At this point, a course car was spotted on the track. Whether or not someone had forgotten that F1 didn't use pace cars after accidents was never established, and it quickly got off the course again. Mansell, meanwhile, was continuing to lead comfortably, with De Angelis behind holding off Warwick, and was soon lapping Johnny Gicotto, who'd also been in for tyres after a puncture, as Warwick finally got past his opponent behind them. He'd clearly been being held up by De Angelis, and rapidly put the Lotus in his mirrors and started to close on Mansell. As he did so, Lauda had also caught up to De Angelis and got past as well, with Rosberg now looming in the Italian's mirrors. Beloff put his Tyrrell into a wall from 9th on lap 10, thankfully not as hard as his teammate Brundle had, and skipped across the track just in time to almost get hit by Patrese as the leaders came up to lap the other Tolman of Ayrton Senna. Patrese's teammate Cheever was out already, and while roving reporter Barry Gill was talking to him, Warwick made a lunge at Mansell and stuffed his Renault into a tyre wall. So now it was Lauda's turn to take over second place, but he wasn't making much of an impression on the leader, nor could he shake off De Angelis and Rosberg behind. Back to Barry Gill, who asked Cheever how the track was, and once again the cameras thereby missed something on track, in this case De Angelis getting back past Lauda and catching right up to Mansell, who seemed to have slowed down a bit. In Canada, De Angelis had blocked Mansell repeatedly, and now Nigel returned the favour. Peter Waugh must have been tearing his hair out in the Lotus pit, but it was great for the neutral to watch, as the top five were now running nose to tail: Mansell, De Angelis, Lauda, Rosberg, Prost, with Tombe and Piquet behind. Whatever had been ailing Nigel seemed to clear up, and the Loti began pulling away once more, with Rosberg nipping past Lauda into third during a commercial break. De Angelis wasn't letting Mansell get a moment's rest, and before long Rosberg was right up behind the pair of them. Tombe, meanwhile, had caught up to the McLarens, which had swapped positions, with Prost now ahead of Lauda. Rothengatter pulled off with a fuel leak, which had soaked through his overalls and burned his bottom. He rushed into the spectator area and commandeered some cups of water to pour over his nether regions, and while Stefan Belloff was giving his views on the circuit, not complimentary, Rosberg hustled his way past De Angelis into second, and now took over the job of harrying Mansell. Both Keke and Nigel were brave, uncompromising drivers, so this would either be a fun race to watch, or they'd take each other out fairly quickly. Mansell certainly wasn't going to make it easy on him, closing the door a couple of times, much to Rosberg's frustration. It was cracking stuff to watch, and if it weren't for the fiasco over the track surface, the race would already be shaping up to be the best one of the year. The 80,000 fans packed into the circuit were certainly enjoying it, and had decided they liked the dogged Mansell and were cheering the Lotus on. By now, it was about a third distance, though at the unexpectedly low average speed of just over 80 miles an hour, it was looking rather like the race would be flagged at the 2-hour limit, and the course was visibly breaking up once more, with tyre tracks visible through what had essentially become gravel in some corners. Rosberg dropped back a bit to take a breather, but didn't let Mansell get too far ahead, while Prost had caught De Angelis and was angling for third. Tombe wiped off a wheel on lap 27, joining the surprisingly short list of retirements so far, and promoting Piquet up into the points, and Rosberg drove up to the back of Mansell for another go. In fact, Mansell seemed to have slowed again, concertinaing the top five back up behind him once more. Rosberg was clearly getting frustrated, shaking his fist at Mansell as the Englishman slammed the door once again, but Nigel was under no obligation to make life easy for Keke, and he didn't. Behind them, Prost had made it past De Angelis, and Mansell was able to gain a bit of breathing room by putting a lapped Palmer between himself and Rosberg, but not for long as the top four continued going at it hammer and tongs. Mansell locked slightly, causing Rosberg to back off and allowing Prost through, and immediately he was going for the lead, but the Finn was having none of it and got past during a commercial break. Half distance, half of the planned laps that is, came and went, and still the top five were running in a train with Mansell at the head, as the ambient temperature now topped 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 centigrade. And then finally on lap 35, Mansell just clipped the inside of a corner, not enough to do any damage, but just enough to let Rosberg finally barge past into the lead. Mansell tried to get it back a few corners later, but had to bail out of the move, and now it was his turn to wave his fist. And that was that. Rosberg began to pull away as Mansell, his good years wrecked, peeled in for new boots after Prost went past too. So Rosberg led Prost, with De Angelis third, then Lauda, with Piquet fifth, and Arnoux having fought his way up to sixth from the back, and made his way past Piquet on lap 40. De Angelis was having engine trouble, and lost third, and soon had Arnoux on his tail too. A few laps later, Piquet's throttle stuck open and put him in a wall, though not fast enough to do him any harm, while Prost was having yet another go at Rosberg for the lead as the pair came to lap Alboreto. The CBS coverage, apparently intent on missing every single on-track incident, was showing the audience a list of tyre compounds when Prost overtook Rosberg for the lead, and then, while they were off for a commercial break, Arnoux passed Lauda for third. By now, 75% of the planned distance had been covered, so full points would be awarded, and the race was approaching its 2-hour limit. Attrition was also beginning to take its toll, as the drivers became exhausted in what one team owner estimated at in-cockpit temperatures of 140 Fahrenheit, 60 degrees C. Alboreto clipped a wall on lap 54 and bent his right rear, making it 12 retirements, all but Rothengatter with his fuel leak, and Jonathan Palmer with electrical problems due to spins or accidents. Ayrton Senna had been back up to fourth briefly, only to clip a wall on lap 47 and retire. He stormed back into the Tolman pit, telling his race engineer Pat Simmons that the wall must have moved because he'd gone through it exactly the same way as he had every other lap. On lap 57, Prost clipped a wall while CBS were off talking to Barry Gill in the pits and pulled up right behind Alboretto's Ferrari. So Rosberg was back in the lead, with Arnoux gaining on him and Lauda third, as Boutsen also parked up in the same spot as Alboretto and Prost. The track was breaking up badly just there, pitching drivers into the wall if they weren't careful. On lap 61, with 10 minutes to go before the timer ran out, it was Lauda's turn, ending his 150th Grand Prix and going over to chat to Thierry, Alain and Michele on the wall. The 2-hour limit expired just as they began the planned last lap, 67, and so it was left to Keke Rosberg to take his third career win, with Arnoux completing a remarkable recovery from the back of the grid to second at the finish. Elio De Angelis hung on for third to maintain his excellent record and move up to second in the standings, and Jacques Laffite nursed his Williams home fourth. Nigel Mansell was running fifth, only to suffer an attack of Lotus gearbox on the very last corner. Unable to believe his bad luck, Nigel got out and started pushing. With the crowd roaring him on, he pushed the Lotus towards the start-finish line as Piercarlo Ghinzani swept gratefully past to score his first ever points and Ozella's first since 1982. The effort was all too much for Nigel and he collapsed onto the track, having nonetheless done enough to secure the final point. If the stands had had roofs, the crowd would have lifted them off with their cheers for his efforts. Rosberg returned to the Parc Fermé with a McLaren driver on each side pod and, sporting a promotional cowboy hat, berated Mansell for his blocking tactics, quite unaware of both the extent to which the crowd had taken the Brit to their hearts and of the last corner drama. He was roundly booed, much to his own surprise. Ayrton Senna was right, by the way. After the race it was found that the wall he'd clipped on lap 47 had moved somewhere between 4 and 10 millimetres further out onto the track due to an accident the previous lap. The Dallas Grand Prix had probably been the best so far this year in terms of pure racing, but marred by the problems with the surface and the heat. If the race could be held at a cooler time of year and the problems with the asphalt could be sorted, it might well prove a popular fixture in the future. With the North American tour completed, the teams packed up to return to Europe and, for many of them, their home Grand Prix at Silverstone.